Fiona Cuthbertson coming for the pod to record another episode of Off the Cuff. This week we're lucky enough to have Tom Harris for this election special. Tom is a British journalist and former politician. He was the MP for Glasgow South for 14 years, as well as a minister in the Department of Transport. He is currently lead non-executive director for the Office of Secretary of State for Scotland and Advocate General, a position he's held since 2021, and is also a non-executive director at HS2. A podcasting legend himself, he hosted The Imposter for many years and was a founding member of the podcast The Power of Three, which discusses all things Doctor Who. Welcome, Tom.
Good morning, Fiona. You also should mention perhaps that I was the first MP to host an MP's podcast, me and Jamie Reid, Copeland MP. We have two men in a pod for a number of years, which we did in the 2010 Parliament, which was good fun.
Excellent stuff. Talk a bit about that later. In the meantime, firstly, can you tell us a bit about your political journey?
Well, I don't know if you like roller coasters. My wife doesn't, and it has been a bit up and down since my younger days. I joined the Labour Party in 1984. The year previous to that, 1983, the general election, I did not vote Labour. I was brought up in a very Labour household. My mother was really staunchly Labour. I did fall out because I refused to vote Labour. I just refused to vote for a party that wanted unilateralism and Michael Foot as the leader. I ended up voting SDP in my constituency in North Ayrshire, thereby allowing the Conservatives, John Corrie, to win because the Labour vote was so badly split, as happened right across the country in that election. But I actually was quite a fan of Neil Kinnock, and I joined the Labour Party basically because he was the leader. And from that moment, as you know yourself, when you get involved in a party, you become a wee bit obsessive, especially at that age, just obsessed with the Labour Party over the next few years. And the privilege of working for it, I was the party's first ever full-time press officer in Scotland. And that was great because it was a real privilege. I got to work with the likes of Donald Dewar, John Smith, Robin Cook, none of whom is with us anymore, sadly, and also Gordon Brown and Tony Blair. That's when I first met Tony. And when Tony became leader, of course, I adopted a position of full-throated, enthusiastic supporter of Tony's, which I still am. I've not shaken that off in all the years that have followed. So I became an MP in 2001, so at the start of Labour's second term in office. As you said in your intro, I was a minister appointed by Tony in the aftermath of the so-called September coup in 2006, when a number of my colleagues cunningly decided that if we got rid of Tony and replaced him with Gordon, then the next general election was ours for the taking. And as has proved, they were spot on with that particular bit of analysis. And I objected to their attempts to remove Tony. And after a complicated series of events, I was appointed to the government, sacked 2 years later by Gordon. And then we went into opposition in 2010. And in 2015, after the independence referendum, I lost my seat along with 40 other Scottish Labour MPs. And since then, I've managed to earn a living by a combination of journalism, non-executive director roles, and public affairs.
And can I ask, how was it when you lost your seat in 2015? Were you expecting to lose, or was it a shock?
It was not a shock, unfortunately. The referendum was just awful. It was just a terrible, terrible experience. And in the immediate aftermath of it, for a couple of weeks, Labour still maintained a healthy lead in the polls in Scotland. But we knew something was wrong. In Glasgow and in my own seat, the majority of voters had voted yes, even though Scotland had voted no, which was a bad sign in itself. And by the start of 2015, the polls were being unambiguously dreadful for us. I called a meeting of my staff in my constituency office in January 2015 and said to them, look, I've spoken to various people in the party and colleagues. Our internal polling confirms what the public polls are telling us. I'm going to lose. And if you guys want to start applying for new jobs, then feel free to do so. Take as much time off as you need to job hunt. From now until May is the only time we've got left in this job. And it was quite upsetting. And my wife worked for me at the time. She was upset because, we both had young kids at primary school. We had a big mortgage and we were facing defeat and unemployment. So we had to fight the campaign. Just day in and day out, it was a real slog, pretending to my activists and to voters that there was a chance, but knowing that there wasn't. And I found out subsequently, actually, my activists, who were just a brilliant group of people, had the same approach as I did. They were putting on a brave face for me, and I thought I was the one putting the brave face on for them. And they were just great. I'm incredibly grateful to all of them because they put in so much work, but it was to no avail.
And what do you think is a common myth about being a politician that's not the case?
People have always had a negative approach to politicians. I used to tell visitors to the Commons when I was giving them my tour about the Great Fire of 1834 when the palace burned to the ground. On the south bank of the Thames, a crowd gathered not to show sympathy but to applaud the destruction of this great iconic palace. So hatred and distrust of politicians is not new. Everyone thinks that politicians are in it for themselves. But I was privileged to work with some of the best people that I've ever known in the House of Commons. People who are just 100% committed to their constituencies. And just because they were a bit fond of self-promotion and publicity does not detract from the fact that they were completely committed to their communities. And if they were self-publicists, that was only because their re-election sometimes depended on that. I just think MPs in general are good people who are in it for the right reasons, and they get so much shit thrown at them that they do not deserve.
And what has been the highlight of your career?
I think it was being a minister. Opposition is a complete waste of time. It's a ridiculous thing for any grown-up human being to want to do because you can't do anything. It's just pointless. Opposition is only worthwhile if you're using it to get back into government, and government is only worthwhile if you're using your powers for the good of the people you represent. So when you're a minister, you can actually make decisions. You can actually change things. And I was a junior minister, so there wasn't a lot I could change, but the things that I did change meant something. Now, you can use your influence and you can use publicity to get things done as a backbencher, and good MPs do that. But you're severely limited when you're a minister, and when you can take a decision and you're not just ticking a box approving a decision or a recommendation that a civil servant has made. If you're actually saying, well, actually, no, I don't want to do this, I want to do something else, then you really do feel as if you're making a difference. One very quick example. I am the man that saved the Blackpool tram, which is an iconic system. Late one night, I was in the department and I was asked if I could squeeze a final meeting in, which wasn't in my schedule. And these two civil servants came in looking kind of shamefaced, and they handed me a bit of paper, which was a report and a recommendation that I refused funding for the upgrading of the Blackpool and Fleetwood tram. The consequences of which would have been that the whole system would have to be shut down, because if you couldn't upgrade it to European safety standards, then there's no way you could run it. And my first reaction, no, I can't approve this. I'm not going to be the person that signs the death warrant of the Blackpool tram. But I'm pretty sure I could see a look of relief on their faces. They didn't want to have to make this recommendation. You could just tell they were looking for some kind of way out. Next day, I called a meeting of my civil service and said, look, we need to look again at this, and we need to look at the business case, and let's just look at all the options, because closing it just is not acceptable. Also, I mean, I was a very political minister. I was thinking of the general election. I wanted to protect colleagues' seats, and there was 2 marginal seats in Blackpool that I wanted to give the incumbents the best chance of re-election. And I make no apology for that. That's just part of the job. And after months of looking again at the figures, they came back and they're a bit of a spring in their step, the same 2 civil servants. And they said, we've found a way of doing this. And we had found no extra money. We just found a different way of adding up the numbers. And I was able to go to Blackpool and announce that we were going to fund the upgrade after all. And it was fantastic. I just felt that's a good thing. So I'm very proud of that.
You were at the heart of the Blairite government. What do you think the government of that time will be remembered for, and what do you think it should be remembered for?
I wouldn't say I was at the heart of it. I mean, I was on the fringes most of the time. I wasn't a close confidant of Tony's, but I was certainly involved in the Blairite clique during Tony's government and Gordon's. The fact is that the Blair government, rightly or wrongly, will be remembered for one thing only, and that's Iraq. And that's a shame. I still maintain that given the information that we had at the time and the degree of trust we had in that intelligence, then what we did by voting to join the American invasion was the right thing to do. It's very easy to, with hindsight, to say, but subsequently we discovered he didn't have any weapons of mass destruction. Well, that's true. Subsequently we didn't, but at the time, that's what we thought. And the argument at the time from opponents of the war, not, oh, don't invade Iraq, they don't have WMD. The argument at the time was, don't invade Iraq. Israel's got WMD as well, and you're not invading them, are you? Which was a ludicrous argument to make. Saddam had actually used weapons of mass destruction against his own people and against Iran. If you've already used them, then the chances are you still got them. And it turns out he didn't, but that was the information we had at the time. That aside, I think the achievements of the Blair governments were immense. I think setting aside devolution, which I think was a mistake, and that happened before I was an MP, so I'm not going to take any responsibility for that. Two most important achievements of the Blair government were the massive decrease in poverty, both among pensioners, thanks to the reforms we made to the pension system, and to child poverty, which for me is the most important thing that any government could do. And also, we trebled NHS spending. We actually trebled it. We got that number and we multiplied it by 3. So when people say, there's no difference between a Conservative and Labour government, I would ask them just to look at the history books.
You did leave the Labour Party a couple of years ago, though, now. So where would you say your political home is at the moment?
It's actually 6 years ago, believe it or not. It's a long time now. I left in 2018 at the height of the anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. I'm a very strong supporter of the Jewish community and of Israel. I just couldn't stand the thought that any of the money I was paying per month to the Labour Party was going towards that shower. But, I'll be voting Labour at this election. I didn't vote Labour at the last 2 general elections in 2017 or 2019. I voted Conservative both times simply because of Jeremy Corbyn. I could not and would not in all conscience vote for a Labour Party that's led by a man who does not have Britain's best interests at heart. He was not a patriot. He supported a terrorist organisation during the Irish Troubles. This is a man who protested the trial of the Brighton bomber. He went to a commemorative event in Conway Hall in London in memoriam of fallen Irish terrorists who'd been killed by the security services as they tried to bomb a police station. I mean, this man should never have been allowed to stand as a Labour candidate at all. And the fact that he did says quite a lot about the misjudgment of Labour Party leaders. So I voted for the only party that could stop it. I mean, I can't believe the mess that the Tories have made of the country and of the government. I mean, I'm just embarrassed. I'm quite impressed by Starmer. And in Scotland, of course, you have to vote for whichever party will be most to defeat the SNP. We still have an SNP MP in my constituency, Stuart MacDonald, who I like a lot. I've got a lot of respect for him, a lot of time. He's actually one of the more sensible Nats. And I've told him I'm not voting for him, and I never would. He knows that. But I'll be voting Labour this time just to get rid of the SNP. Not Stuart personally, I have to emphasise, but to get rid of the SNP. I've still some reservations about Starmer, but I do think, all things being equal, the re-election of this government would be bad for the country. Whether Starmer means it or not, I think his phrase, country before party, really does matter.
Another way you differentiated yourself from other people in your party was your views on Brexit. How did you become the director of Scottish Vote Leave?
That's quite a story. It'd be wrong to say that I was always a Eurosceptic. I mean, I wasn't, but then you got to remember that when we were in government, there was no prospect of a referendum. So you didn't need to take a position, but I was always a bit sceptical. I was very, very opposed to adoption of the euro. I was absolutely staunchly opposed to that and had been since before I was an MP. So the kind of underlying scepticism of the European project and a central plank of the European project was always there. But when I lost my seat in 2015, a referendum now in prospect, I was telling friends that I'd probably vote Remain, not particularly enthusiastically, but I just thought, well, why not? All my friends are voting that way, I might as well. And then David Cameron spoke in the House of Commons, and I was listening to the radio. He had just come back from his renegotiation of the treaties. And he stood in the Commons. He listed all these things that he had achieved. And I was listening to them, and I was kind of doing that kind of gammon middle-aged thing where I was shouting at the radio and telling my wife, that wasn't him, that was agreed by John Major, or that was agreed by Tony Blair. Nothing that he came back with was of any substance whatever. Nothing. I think he managed to negotiate a change in the font of some of the letters that went out from the European Commission, but I think, it went from Helvetica to Arial or something. It was that insignificant. I remember it was a kind of epiphany because I thought, this is a man committed to a referendum, and all of the European leaders know that he's committed to a referendum. He has said to them, look, I really need something of substance to persuade people to vote Remain. And they have turned round and said, no. And I remember thinking, this is an organisation that is incapable of reform. It's not that it doesn't want to reform. It's that even if it wanted to reform, it just can't do that. And there were plenty of things that I thought needed reform. And I remember thinking at the time, well, sod this, I'm going to vote Leave. And I still didn't think Leave were going to win. And I wrote something for The Independent because John Rentoul's a friend, and I said to him that I changed my mind. And I wrote, so something appeared in the Independent, and then I got a phone call from Douglas Carswell, and he said, "Would you like to do something for us next time you're in London?" It was all very, very informal. So next time I was in London, I went down to Leave's headquarters and I met Matthew Elliott, who I had known because as an MP, I'd done a bit of work for No to AV back in 2011. And Matthew basically offered me the job of being director of Vote Leave in Scotland. And I said, well, can I phone my wife about this? Because it's quite a big step when you've been in the Labour Party most of your life and then suddenly you're taking a high profile position against what most people in the Labour Party want. So I phoned Carol. She was already a Leave voter, by the way. She decided to vote Leave before I did. And we decided that it was only for 3 months. This was in March 2016. And I said, yeah, why not? Let's do this. Back in the campaign saddle much earlier than I thought it was ever going to be. I thought 2015 would be my last campaign. But what incensed me after the referendum and what led to a further separation of me from the Labour Party was that the Labour Party had not only voted for the referendum, they had said publicly that they would respect the outcome of the referendum. But then it emerged that the only reason they said that was because they thought that Remain were going to win. They didn't actually mean it. What they meant was they would respect a Remain victory, but they wouldn't respect a Leave victory. And they lied. And then they did everything they could in the House of Commons and to try to reverse that result. And I was furious at them. And not even because I was a Leave voter. I was furious at them, and I would have been furious at them had I voted Remain. If the Labour Party had supported Theresa May's stopgap plan instead of allowing it to wither on the vine, two things would have happened. First of all, we would have left the EU while remaining in the single market, which is what quite a lot of Labour voters and MPs I know would have wanted. And they would have also have destroyed the Conservative Party, probably terminally, because the Conservative Party could not have continued in government, and they couldn't have continued as a cohesive single party, having voted for Brexit with the help of the Labour Party. And also, actually, the third thing that would have happened is that Jeremy Corbyn would have become Prime Minister. So in hindsight, I'm glad they did what they did, but it was shameless. It was dishonest. And when 2019 came and the general election, they thoroughly deserved the kicking that the electorate gave them as a result of that.
And do you think that if the Labour Party win in the next election, that they might again look to reverse Brexit?
Starmer's too clever to do that. They know that the only way we can actually fully rejoin is with a referendum. They also know that rejoining is just not going to be a possibility, I think, ever, because it would mean adopting the euro, and the British people won't accept that. I think there might be moves to rejoining the single market, which I think politically, democratically, you might be able to do without a referendum, but you would need at least a mandate from a party manifesto to do that. So until they're in a position where they're confident enough to put that in a manifesto, they will have to settle for closer relationship, whatever that means.
So, with respect to the election on the 4th of July, what advice are you going to give the leaders of each party ahead of polling day?
Not that they need my advice, although I would say that Rishi Sunak certainly needs some better advice than what he's been receiving so far. I watched Sunak's interview with Nick Robinson, and actually I thought Sunak did as well as anyone could have expected. It was the first time I'd heard quite a coherent, robust defence of the government's record and its future programme. And it was the first time I kind of saw Sunak do his job, really. You know, I thought he was as effective as he could be. I would certainly advise Sunak to stop playing ordinary man, stop asking people about football. I know nothing about football. I would never pretend to know anything about football. And when middle-class people who don't know anything about football start talking about it in an attempt to become Mr. Ordinary, that just sounds embarrassing. And he really should stop that. Just be yourself. Just be your authentic. You're a multimillionaire. Stop being embarrassed about that. That's just who you are, and there's nothing you do to change that. So just be yourself. Say what you think. Stop using phrases like "I'm prepared to take bold action," because that doesn't sound like a human speaking. That sounds like you're reading off of a leaflet. Just speak in ordinary words that people understand and can relate to. And also, I would advise them to stop looking like a rabbit caught in the headlamps. You're going to get defeated. Deal with it. It's happened to other people. It happened to Winston Churchill, for God's sake. And if he can deal with it, you can deal with it. Stoicism, more accomplished politicians than you have faced these odds and been able to smile afterwards. So follow the example of John Major, whose performance after the general election was actually far more impressive than it was during it in 97. And as far as Keir Starmer is concerned, it is a safety first strategy he's following, and I don't blame him for that. because why would you take any risks when you're 20 points ahead? I wish he would take a stronger stance on women's rights. I think he's got absolutely zero to lose in terms of seats or votes if he were actually to come out unequivocally and support Rosie Duffield in Canterbury. You know, his only elected MP in Kent, he's hardly spoken 2 words to her in the last 5 years. She's been treated shamefully. And I think not only should he be making a visit to Canterbury to support her unequivocally, I think he should be making her a minister in the government after July 5th. As for the other party leaders, you know, I mean, dear me, what can you say about the Liberals and the SNP and the Greens? I mean, I've really nothing to say to them. This is a fight between the Conservatives and the Labour Party. Labour's going to win, Tories are going to get humped, and the rest of them will have very small parts to play.
And what values do you think are the most important that each party should encapsulate during this election?
Party before country. This has been the biggest wake-up call for me. This is what I've learned in the last 6 years since I resigned from the Labour Party. I mean, I will never be a tribalist again. I will never say my party right or wrong, which is what I've been guilty of in the past. And I think a lot of people who are members of any party are guilty of it. You know, you will support the party through thick or thin, and admirable to an extent. But I would never again support any political party if I thought its policies were bad for the country. And I would love to see our political leaders making the same statement, to say that it's not parties that matter. Parties do not matter. The Conservative Party doesn't matter. The Labour Party doesn't matter, because they're political parties. And by definition, they don't matter. What matters are the people of this country. What matters are the institutions and the values of this country. And putting Britain's interests ahead of everything is something that every party should be able to do. And if they can't do it, they shouldn't be in the game. They should be roundly defeated at every election that where they stand. Putting the British people's interests first. That's more important than any party and any policy.
Going to policy briefly, though, what do you think is going to be the most important issue on the doorstep?
That's an excellent question. It's the economy, isn't it? The cost of living crisis, and it's spending. You know, when people talk about, oh, we need extra spending on local services, I think that matters less to most people than what their pay packet is and how much tax they've paid. So I think people are desperate for a break. I think it's a really interesting fact, and I've not seen it fact checked, so I don't know how accurate this is, but the Prime Minister said last night in his interview that the average worker paying a lower rate of tax now than they have for more than 50 years. Now, that is quite an astonishing fact if it turns out to be true. And if it does turn out to be true, then why on earth have the Tories waited this long to actually remind people of that, when all the headlines are about, you know, the highest tax burden in 70 years? But people do need to pay less tax. And we need to explain to people that whatever concerns they have about climate change and the net zero targets, the most important thing the next government must do is generate economic growth. Because without growth, we get no tax revenue. Without tax revenue, you can't invest in anything, NHS or anything else. So economic growth is the key, both to tax cuts and to investment.
You've been a transport specialist for many years. So what do you think of the cancelling of HS2? And do you think Labour should bring it back if they become the next government?
It's interesting you should ask that, because while I've been a member of the HS2 board, I've not spoken publicly about HS2 at all, because I didn't want to be quizzed on this. But I'm leaving the board at the end of this month, so why not? I think that was a disaster by Sunak. I think it was just shockingly short-sighted. We already know that Sunak gets really bad advice from his advisors, and HS2 is a perfect example of that. We now have basically the most expensive, or plans for the most expensive shuttle service between Old Oak Common and Birmingham, and it's no longer going to be part of a strategic network. That is a shocking waste of money. It'd have been far better not to build a single foot of it. But now that, you know, nearly half of it has actually been built, now to cancel phase 2A and 2B is just so short-sighted and very typically British, I have to say. We are not good at looking in the long term. We're not good at infrastructure projects. Now, HS2 has not handled the building of it well at all. Let's not dwell on that. Inflation has pushed the cost of it up far too high. The original estimates when it was first started were artificially low, and I would say dishonestly low, in order to get the go-ahead from nervous politicians. But we are where we are. I hate that phrase, but we are. And, you know, it's embarrassing to have one line of HS2 built from London to Birmingham, not even to Euston. I mean, it's just absurd. So yeah, I do hope Labour brings some commitment to it and look at this again. We should, in this country, be able to build high-speed lines the same as every other country builds them. And we need to look again, possibly at the delivery mechanism for it, as well as the politics and the economics.
And it's also the confidence, of course, within the sector, because even though other projects have been committed to, I suppose they might think, well, who knows, that might get cancelled in the future as well.
Absolutely. Still, I remain a Keynesian. I think that government spending on big projects is key to generating economic growth and developing skills and apprenticeships and employment. And this announcement by Sunak has thrown the manufacturing, train manufacturing, into panic, because manufacturers were waiting on orders from HS2, and those orders, because of the curtailed length of the project, the orders are smaller now than they were expected. People's jobs depend on them. Here's the question: what credit did Sunak get for doing that? How many extra seats does he think that he will have secured as a result of that decision? He announced it at a Conservative Party conference last year to enthusiastic applause from the NIMBYs in the audience, but what has it actually gained him? It dealt a blow to his personal reputation, and it has not saved a single Conservative seat, either along the line or beyond it. It was a pointless decision. It was utter self-sabotage. I will never understand why he listens to the such bad advice on these occasions.
And talking of things that are going to potentially dent the number of Conservative seats, obviously Reform has stepped into play now. So what do you think the impact of that is going to be on the Conservative vote in the next election?
Well, I understand why the Conservatives are very nervous about it. Looking at the polls, Reform are not that far behind the Conservatives. People have written off the Conservative Party in the past. There were those who said they would never recover from 1997. And incidentally, Tony Blair was one of the few people who would always remind Labour MPs not to underestimate the Conservatives' capacity for revival, and he was right. So we'll see on July the 5th just how bad this defeat is going to be. It is quite conceivable, after all, that the Conservatives don't recover from this, that they are eventually replaced by Reform or something similar, or there's some kind of merger. If someone tells me that they know what's going to happen, I wouldn't believe them, because we're in an environment now where extinction level events do happen. But parties have shown incredible resilience. Not just the Conservative Party. Look at Scottish Labour, which is set now to take maybe 30-odd seats in Scotland, having won only a single seat in two of the last three general elections. So parties can survive. It just depends on the public, I guess, and their appetite for listening to the same old parties that they feel have let them down in the past. But, Farage is a force of nature, whether we accept it or not. And Reform may have a big part to play. They may disappear. Farage may not get elected. He might end up being the only one of his party elected and then get defeated the next election. I honestly don't know. But it feels different this time for the Conservatives. In 97, the Conservatives still managed to scrape 30% of the vote. There was only an 11-point difference between them and the Labour Party in 97. And the Conservatives end up with exactly half of the number of MPs that they started off with. So they went down to 165. Some of the polls this time show the Conservatives going into double figures. I think I don't know if that's going to happen. I suspect it won't, but if it did, I think it could be the end of the road for the Conservatives. And as I've said before, so what? It's just a political party. The Labour government will need an opposition. It has to come from somewhere, but no party has the right to exist. That goes for all of the parties.
What do you think about what's going on over in Wales at the moment?
I think Welsh Labour are suffering from the same kind of disease that the SNP suffer from in Scotland. This kind of arrogant entitlement. Doesn't matter what they do, they'll always get re-elected. I suspect Gething won't be with us for long. I think it's unprecedented for any First Minister to continue after losing a vote of confidence. There's a lot of questions he still has to answer, and I suspect that they cannot be answered truthfully while he remains First Minister. Welsh Labour, they've done better than Scottish Labour during the devolution era, and I think there's a cultural reason there. Scottish Labour bent over backwards not to disagree with Tony Blair's government in the early years of devolution, whereas Welsh Labour stood up to Tony and insisted on appointing their own leaders, contrary to what the candidate that Tony wanted. And I think that created a break between Welsh Labour and UK Labour, which has benefited Labour in Wales in the devolution era, whereas in Scotland, I think it became too synonymous. Both Donald Duran and Jack McConnell went to great lengths not to disagree with Tony, and I think that was actually bad politically from a domestic point of view. But I think Welsh Labour, like the Conservatives at Westminster, probably could do with a little spell in opposition.
And do you think social media will have an impact on the election?
Yeah, I think it inevitably will. I mean, I think every election since 2005, I think, has been described as the social media election. And it's never been true, but the influence has always been increasing. And I think at this election, like in 2019, people's attitudes have been shaped more by social media than by the mainstream media. And it's very unhealthy because the central role of social media is echo chamber. You follow people that you agree with, and then they reinforce everything you agree with. And it kind of insulates you against contrary opinions. And it just adds to the polarization that we've seen in politics. I've got friends, adults, people my age, who publicly say on Twitter and Facebook how much they really, really hate individual politicians, usually Conservatives, in a kind of way that you would expect maybe in fifth or sixth form at school. But you wouldn't expect grown adults to behave that way and speak that way. And they'll use really appalling language to describe politicians they disagree with. Now, that infantilism of politics has emerged because of social media. There's no doubt about that. That's a bad sign for grown-up politics, I think. It is infantile the way the most people talk about politics now.
Obviously, I am delighted that you're on the podcast. I am terribly pleased that you're here, and you had, as you mentioned, one of the first political podcasts. Can you tell us a bit about that story and how you ended up doing that and whether or not you're tempted to revive it?
I think it might have been in the 2005 Parliament after I'd lost my ministerial job. And I had a blog and I had a Twitter account that was doing quite well. I was just thinking about, what the limits were for MPs in terms of social media. I hadn't even thought of a podcast. I was thinking more of, internet radio station or something. And I got a phone call or an email from Jamie Reid, who I didn't know that well, but I got on well with him, the Copeland MP. And he said, let's do something. So this was just coincidentally at the time I was thinking of doing something. He was the one that suggested a podcast. And we started mucking about with it in my office. And, I bought some equipment and he came up with the name Two Men in a Pod, which I thought was funny. And we used to record it weekly. And it's usually just the two of us. Sometimes we'd have colleagues in. Sometimes we'd deliberately have Conservatives and Liberals in, just have an argument with them, because Jamie and I agreed on everything. And sometimes listening to two people agree with each other on a podcast isn't the most entertaining thing. So we'd bring in people that we did disagree with and we'd have a laugh with them. And it was all very good-natured. Didn't get many listeners at all or much attention, but we really enjoyed it. And I started doing a thing called Desert Island Flicks because I'm interested in movies, and I used to interview other MPs and ask them what their favourite movies were, and we'd talk about movies for a little while. And once again, not very profound or particularly political, but it was good fun. And I wanted to kind of show any audience that MPs were humans, with the same interests and priorities as everybody else. I'm not sure how successful that was, but that was always the intention. And then, of course, I lost my seat and I did The Imposter, which was a kind of autobiographical, just a chronological explanation of my journey. I deliberately did them in very short episodes, 15 minutes each podcast. I wanted something that was a bit shorter. And it went down okay, good listening numbers, got a lot of good reviews. But I finished it at the point where I left the Labour Party. I just didn't think it was appropriate to continue the narrative beyond then. I've thought about revisiting it actually and doing longer episodes covering the same terrain but a bit more detail. I don't know if I'll do that. But I do love the podcasting medium. I don't do media interviews anymore. I don't do broadcast interviews, but I do the occasional podcast just because I think it's an innovative and interesting way of discussing things. You get a bit more time, as you can tell, from my very long, waffly answers.
Fantastic answers. And you've been very open and honest. And I think that's wonderful. So thank you very much for that. And on that note, thank you, Tom, for giving us your insight and thoughts on what's proving to be an interesting election period and certainly an interesting time in politics in general. Thank you to the listeners who've hopefully enjoyed the show as much as we've enjoyed making it. Please remember again, you must go and vote on the 4th of July. If you have any questions regarding the podcast, please feel free to comment. If you think it's worth coming back, please like and subscribe. If you feel you need something to tide you over to the next podcast, please buy my book Party Games on Amazon. And on that note, I'll see you next time. Hope you have a good week, one and all.